But the first person I will introduce will be our keynote speaker for the session is Professor Fadhel Kaboub. He has a long biography. I'll try and shorten it. Yeah, many in the room would tell me that he needs little introduction, but he's definitely a distinguished professor of economics at Denison University, from where he's currently on leave, but he's also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Professor Kaboub is an associate professor, as I mentioned, and he has over 2 decades of experience as a teacher, scholar, and policy advisor. His work focuses on enhancing monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south, building resilience and fostering equitable and sustainable prosperity. He's an expert in modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, job guarantee, and reparations. He has held research affiliations with such prestigious institutions as Harvard Kennedy School, PowerShift Africa, and Economic Research Forum, amongst others. He's widely published in reputable journals, and also his media commentaries on climate change have featured in such venerable channels as the New York Times, Financial Times, and The Guardian.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here, and it's a pleasure to join you in this important conversation. I'll start by thanking both Coda and Ideas and all the people who made this happen. It's an honor to be here. What I'll present today is a Pan-African just transition framework, and I'll use the modern monetary theory framework to illustrate how this can be delivered in the context of a multipolar world that is to be created. And I would argue it would be created via Pan-African strategic partnership. So with that, let me start by highlighting this Just Transition report that many of you have it in front of you now. It's available online also in French. This was produced more than a year ago now. It was convened by Dr. Yuba Sikona, and it was produced by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development. The main argument that we're trying to make here is that the main audience for this report are African policymakers, and the main focus is to break the silos that are traditionally held between discussions about climate policies, energy policies, and development policies, and to present a Pan-African, coherent, long-term, strategic, transformative vision that would simultaneously address the climate, development, and energy challenges that we have on this continent. It was well received across the continent, but also across the global south. So as you'll see, the arguments are relevant beyond the African continent. The main point that really drove the motivation behind this idea is that if you don't have a long-term strategic vision for yourself as a continent, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's strategic vision, whether it's the US or Europe or China. And everybody has every right to have a vision for themselves, and they have every right to use economic diplomacy and incentives to nudge everybody to where they want to see them on the broader economic and geopolitical map. But so do we. And that's the important point to really start the conversation about economic and monetary sovereignty. As Zinabu said earlier in the other panel, that this is something to be built from within, not from the outside. But what is the economic role that is envisioned for us as a continent, for the global south in general, by the major economic blocs? It turns out that it's the exact same colonial role that was imposed on us. And it can be summarized in 3 major points. Number 1, we're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role today. Number 2, we're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world. We still play that role today. And number 3, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the global north is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation. But effectively what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still play that role today. So we're talking about colonial economic architectures that persist. And our argument is that you cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Similarly, you can't democratize it or de-dollarize it. So colonial structures that I described here, they were not designed for a just transition. They were not designed to produce the SDGs. They were not designed to produce human rights or democracy. Why are we expecting a colonial architecture to deliver any of these results? It cannot. So that's why we're talking about none of the SDGs are achievable without decolonization of the economy. None of this discussion about a just transition is achievable without structural decolonization. So what are these structural economic traps and deficiencies that we're talking about? Of course, everybody's familiar with the problem of external debt, and it's a serious problem because it destroys the fiscal policy space available to us to invest in the building blocks of development and prosperity. But we argue that external debt is actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that can be summarized in three major points. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, low value added manufacturing. And I'll explain each very briefly. When I say energy deficits, I include our biggest oil exporters on the continent. Nigeria, before the Dangote refinery was open a few months ago, Nigeria imports 100% of its gasoline from international markets. Angola, the second largest exporter, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. Not by accident, by design, because in the old energy system that we're trying to get rid of, the fossil fuel energy system, we've been systematically denied access to technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. And in the new energy system we're trying to build, the same is happening. We're denied access to technology to manufacture and deploy the renewables infrastructure that we need. On the food front, Africa today imports 85% of its food, not by accident, but by design. As soon as we gained independence, major blocks in the global north, starting with the European Union Common Agricultural Policy, the US, Canada, Australia, and beyond, started to invest in core crop production and heavily subsidizing the production of wheat and corn and so on, and forced our farmers into cash crop production. So what do we specialize in producing on the continent? Coffee, tea, tobacco, and all the complementary food items. And the concept of food security, which is a dangerous post-colonial term, was invented during that time period, to the point where you hear systematically from global north ministers of agriculture and senior officials, when they talk about Europe and the global north, they talk about food sovereignty. When they switch codes and talk about Africa and the global south, they talk about food security. Food security for you, food sovereignty for us. And I'm happy to elaborate later. And then finally, and most importantly, the kind of manufacturing that we were allowed to have, and I use my words carefully here, is the kind where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to assemble with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we produce value-added content of export that is low, and what we import is high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports with free trade agreements. You're always locked at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that's a structural trap by design, not by accident. So these produce structural trade deficits, which naturally weaken our currencies relative to the dollar, to the euro. And with the weaker currency, anything I need to import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, I import it with inflation built within, which means we import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our society for our livelihood. So, of course, our governments immediately move into defensive positions to protect the most vulnerable. So we subsidize food, we subsidize fuel to prevent riots from happening. And you can't do that for decades without addressing the root causes of these deficiencies. And we ask our central bankers to do their best to protect, defend the exchange rate, strengthen the exchange rate. How do they do it? With a Band-Aid solution. You borrow more dollars and you feed the external debt crisis. And once you're deep in debt, in dollars and euros, you completely rewire all of your priorities as a government to promote any economic activity that can get you those dollars as quickly as possible. And that means more cash crops for exports, low value added manufacturing, and you provide all kinds of incentives for foreign investors to come and abuse the system. And that is the structural trap that we need to get out of, as I'll illustrate in a minute. Just to show you the numbers, this is Africa's exports as a continent. You can eyeball the problem: raw materials, low value added manufacturing, and so on. Notice the volume, $692 billion. Now notice Africa's imports, $791 billion, a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. Again, you can eyeball the composition. We import refined petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, core crops such as rice and wheat and corn and so on. I'm zooming in on Ethiopia just because we're here, but I could have picked any country on this continent or across the global south. Ethiopia's exports, $7 billion. You can see the composition right there. Coffee, cut flowers, for God's sake, cut flowers. You know, Ethiopian Airlines flying flowers every day. While 20 million people are dependent on food aid right here in this country. A country that's blessed with the Nile River, with the fertile soil that you need for food sovereignty, and we're in this structural trap. Not unique to Ethiopia. I just picked a random example here. Look at Ethiopia's exports, imports, $17 billion, all the core crops, pharmaceuticals, and high value-added content. So you create this massive trade imbalance that keeps growing and growing. The more you open to the outside world, the deeper you get in the trap. And of course, the flip side of it is the weakening of the Ethiopian currency year after year, decade after decade. Of course, there are major events that matter, right? Conflicts, COVID, particular prime minister this or prime minister that. Those things matter, but this is something much deeper, much more structural that that persists actually across countries when you look at this data. And this is Ethiopia's external debt stock as a result that's increasing exponentially. And as you know, earlier this year, Ethiopia defaulted on part of its debt. And you have a consumption of this fiscal policy space on the export revenue side, where at some point you have 10, 20, 30, sometimes for some countries up to 50% of your export revenues are actually going to service the debt. And that is part of the structural trap. Now take this on a global scale. Divide the world into global north and global south, and net out all global financial transactions, including trade and aid and debt cancellation and climate finance, illicit financial flows, remittances, everything included. You get that green line. And the last data point we have is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. Money moving in the wrong direction. And that's from several years ago. I have a couple of colleagues and I are working on updating this data to 2023, and the numbers are not going to look pretty, just to give you a preview. So the summary of where we are in terms of climate finance, right? We have a global crisis. We're all in this together. We're supposed to fix it. Global North and Global South. Here's the summary of what we're doing about it. You have $2 trillion, that big circle, moving in the wrong direction. From the countries that didn't cause the climate crisis, the countries that are actually on the front lines of the climate crisis are sending $2 trillion to the global north. That's the neo-colonial wealth extraction, that global economic architecture that I described earlier. Next to it, you have $100 billion that was promised from more than a decade ago. Whatever was delivered was mostly loans, actually majority non-concessional loans. Next to it, you have that tiny green line, green dot. That's the Green Climate Fund. Last time I checked, had $12 billion in it. And that tiny little dot, there is actually a tiny little dot. I don't know if you can see from the back. That's the Loss and Damage Fund. That's $700 million with an M in it. So I always ask people, find me a single climate fund today that can match the annual profits of the top 4 oil companies extracting from this continent. This is the summary of how serious we are about climate finance. So take a picture of this one, take a selfie with it, and send it to your favorite climate negotiator as they go to Baku to negotiate, the NCQG to fix the climate crisis. So that's why we say you can't decarbonize a system that's structurally colonized. So what is this global economic architecture that is sucking wealth from the global south by design, right? This is not a bug in the system. This is the feature, right? So it's the international financial architecture, that's the World Bank and the IMF that everybody's talking about. The international trade and investment architecture, that's the WTO primarily. That's ISDS rules that are weaponized against the global south. And finally, the international taxation architecture, which for the longest time was in the hands of the OECD countries until last November, thanks to the Africa Group and the vote in the UN to finally decolonize international taxation. And now we have a UN convention framework that is being designed as we speak to decolonize international taxation. Unless we change all the pillars of this global economic architecture, we're not going to have a just transition or SDGs or any of the goals that we have. So the structural solutions, very quickly, so we can wrap this up. You go directly to the root causes of these deficiencies. So we invest in food sovereignty and agroecology, not just food security, which happens to be both a climate solution, but it's also a solution to get out of the structural economic entrapment of external debt. Renewable energy sovereignty, not just renewable energies to export for Europe's energy security. And that's, again, a solution to the climate crisis, but it's also a solution to the root causes of our external debt problem. And finally, high value added industrial policies at the Pan-African level, not at the national level, because to industrialize, you need economies of scale. None of our countries has economies of scale to industrialize alone. If you try to do it alone, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. So at the regional level, at least at regional blocks on this continent and across the global south, we have the economies of scale needed, we have the complementarity of resources and capabilities, and on this continent, we have the youngest labor force on the planet to industrialize. What we lack is access to the manufacturing technology. This is where partnership with the external players comes in, and I'll come to that in the next slide. But what are the industrial priorities? Is it to manufacture consumer goods for everybody else to continue consumerism and planned obsolescence and all that? We need the building blocks of development and prosperity on the continent. So using the critical minerals that we have here to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure for the 600 million people who have no access to electricity as we speak. Clean cooking infrastructure for the 950 million people on this continent, mostly women and children who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis. That's an industrialization opportunity. And finally, green public transportation to connect our cities and connect our economies across the continent. Just these three industrial priorities will create millions of jobs and keep us growing in a sustainable way, in a transformative way for decades to come, and truly decolonize the African continent. And of course, none of this is possible without transforming, not just reforming, the global economic architecture I described earlier. So can countries afford this? You know, this is the African economic and monetary sovereignty component of our discussion in this conference, this massive fiscal spending, right? Who's going to pay for it? If you listen to the global north, oh, you have to de-risk for Wall Street to come and transform your economy in an extractive way, obviously, not in an economic sovereignty type of way. So the focus here, can African countries actually finance this massive transformation? The short answer is yes, but with specific details that I'll illustrate here, without bankrupting countries, without causing inflation and hyperinflation and all of that. So this is my approach here, which is modern monetary theory. And I invite you to follow the steps here, because whatever you heard on Twitter is not true. So focus on this concept of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Not all countries have the same degree of monetary sovereignty. When you're at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, like the African continent, you have the weakest degree of monetary sovereignty. So we have countries on this continent that use the CFA currency that have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. They still use a colonial currency. And then most of our countries have limited monetary sovereignty. The goal is to gradually implement strategic investments that will allow us to acquire a higher degree of economic sovereignty and monetary sovereignty. So monetary sovereignty is not something that you declare by decree, like you declare your territory and your flag and your military, whatever. This is something you acquire with strategic transformative investments. So that's the idea. So what is monetary sovereignty? A country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty is able to issue its own currency, of course, collect taxes in the same national currency. These are the easy, straightforward parts. It's 3 and 4 that are critical for us. Number 3, it's a country that can avoid issuing bonds denominated in foreign currencies. So the question is, how do we get to a point where we're actually not compelled to borrow in foreign currencies? And number 4, it's a country that avoids having to defend its exchange rate to protect the most vulnerable on a systematic basis. And this is a key distinction here that we do in MMT and the concept of monetary sovereignty between the currency issuer, which is the sovereign state, versus the rest of us, households and firms, the currency users. And this is not a concept for you to use at home. This is for sovereign states. This is not for companies or individuals to say, oh, we're going to figure out how to increase our monetary sovereignty. This is a macro concept for sovereign states. So here's the main focus is inflation and the risk of inflation. So how much can a country safely spend without causing inflation. The mainstream approach will say, well, you collect taxes and you spend, or you borrow, up to a certain limit. Don't go crazy with the borrowing, but that's it. Beyond that, you're limited. Let the private sector and charity do the rest. There's nothing you can do about it. And what we argue is that there's this additional fiscal capacity that we're not tapping into. It's not infinite. It's not unlimited. It's actually constrained by that red bar, the risk of inflation. So my focus as an MMT economist is to define what determines that red barrier. Is it here? Is it here? Is it smaller? Is it larger? And how can we transform the limit? So the risk of inflation from an MMT perspective is determined by two things. One is the lack of productive capacity, logistics, supply chain disruptions. All of that limits how much you can spend safely without causing inflation. And number two, it's abusive market power. If you have price setters in your system that can raise prices simply because they can, then you're going to bump into the risk of inflation. So the strategy here is to spend strategically in a way that allows you to build additional productive capacity in key areas. In our case, it's food and energy. These are the major sources of inflation. And to tax and regulate abusive market power out of existence. In other words, you democratize your economy. You tackle corruption, internal and external. And I'll illustrate with a couple of brief examples so we know what we're talking about. And this is really the paradigm shift that we want when we talk about economic and monetary sovereignty. So MMT is basically saying increase government spending to fight inflation? What? This doesn't make any sense if you follow any standard economics textbook. Government spending is supposed to cause inflation, even hyperinflation. But here's how we do it. Let me illustrate the classic mainstream approach, why they say you shouldn't do this. Government should not spend on strategic investments. I'm using Ethiopia as a random numerical example here. What if Ethiopia wanted to spend 50 billion Ethiopian birr on healthcare and education, two national priorities? And this is deficit spending, right? In Ethiopian birr, not dollars or euros borrowed from abroad. Here's what the mainstream theory will tell you will happen. And here's why they argue Ethiopia should not do this. Well, number one, you're going to have more imports of food and energy and medical equipment. You're going to have a larger trade deficit, a weaker exchange rate. You're going to have the inflation pass-through effect kicking in, even hyperinflation potentially, because you import inflation with those items. And you're going to have more external debt. The IMF and other foreign lenders will step in and say you need spending cuts, you need austerity. So you have less investment in health and education. You're back to square one with more unemployment, brain drain, social, economic, and political tensions. And you're told there is no alternative. We told you shouldn't even try. It's going to just break the system. And we've heard this before. There is no alternative, right? The market will do it. Ethiopia cannot develop from within, like Zinabu, our colleague earlier said on the previous panel. The endogenous development is, we're told, is impossible, right? Is actually destructive from a mainstream perspective. Here's the MMT alternative approach. I'm using the exact same numerical example. Ethiopia spending 50 billion Ethiopian birrs as deficit spending. But now it's much more strategic and transformative. We're going to spend 25 billion on health and education. The other 25 is to increase domestic productive capacity for food production, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and crack down on corruption, abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation, the sovereign jurisdiction of the state. Here's what happens. You're going to have fewer imports of food and energy. You're going to have lower trade deficits, not larger trade deficit. You're going to have stable, if not stronger, Ethiopian birr exchange rate. You're going to have no inflation pass-through effect because you're killing the source of inflation, which is food and energy imports. You're going to have lower external debt over time, higher credit rating because your external debt is being reduced. You're going to increase foreign currency reserves at the central bank, and you're going to have more resilience to external shocks like conflicts and food and energy security problems and so on. Lower carbon footprint because you're producing locally. You have more employment, less brain drain, improved quality of life for all. Now we're talking. The same deficit, but this is an anti-inflation deficit, not an inflation-inducing deficit. So the question now is Ethiopia's limit for fiscal capacity 50 billion? Maybe it's 60. Maybe it's 100. Maybe it's 150. How do we know? Again, you go back to what determines the risk of inflation: abusive market power and lack of productive capacity, if you have the administrative capacity, the materials, the skilled labor, the regulatory framework to spend more without causing inflation, then you've just increased your fiscal capacity internally without external financing. So that is critical in the MMT approach. And finally, I'll close with the Pan-African component to go beyond Ethiopia. This is our renewable energy potential. According to IRENA, the last report about Africa, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Africa today, with existing renewables technology, not new innovations, can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs by 2040. That's the day after tomorrow. 1,000 times. And completely replace all the fossil fuel exports from the continent. That is a technical study. This is not a political statement. It is possible, it is within reach. Yet the continent attracts less than 2% of financial investments going to renewables and is systematically denied the right to manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure. No transfer of technology. Not my words, off the record conversations with senior officials in the global north. They say nobody in the global south is allowed to industrialize without our approval. Should I say it again? Nobody is allowed to industrialize without our approval. There's a global geopolitical economic hierarchy that is not to be disrupted. Because if Africa can produce 1,000 times its energy needs, it's as if you took OPEC with its economic and geopolitical weight, multiplied it by 1,000. That is perceived as a threat to be managed, a risk to be eliminated, not an opportunity, a win-win for the planet, for everybody. Because repositioning Africa away from the bottom of the global hierarchy is perceived as disruptive. And that is exactly what we want on this continent, is to move away from the bottom of the hierarchy. So if transfer of technology and financing from outside is not coming, despite what all the diplomatic BS you hear in conversation. I'm not a diplomat, so I can say these things. This is where all the critical minerals are. The majority are in the global south. So picture this for a moment. This is what I call the geopolitical bargain of the century. And I'm looking at my chair. This is really the chair. This is the last slide. And I think this is possibly the most controversial, but the best one, I think. What is the bargain of the century? Imagine for a moment a block of countries in Africa or in the global south. It doesn't matter geographically where. A block of 20, 30 countries. We don't have to have everybody. Without China, right? With the complementarity of resources and capabilities, the economies of scale, and with the political commitment to an actual joint industrial policy. It's a big assumption, I grant you that. But imagine for a moment we are there. We have a block that actually wants to industrialize. We have the resources, the capabilities, everything except the technology to manufacture stuff. It's not coming from OECD countries, I guarantee you that. This block going to China today and saying, look, we give you the bargain of the century. In 10 to 15 years, if you replicate the entire value chain of, say, manufacturing solar panels in this block of countries, real industrialization on our terms, if you do that, in 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally. Number two, you double your geopolitical weight globally, and you secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about, including China. China will take the bargain, especially today with Europe and the US closing their markets to Chinese high-tech products. We are the biggest market on the planet, except we don't have the purchasing power yet. But if we industrialize, we'll have the purchasing power. We have the biggest market on the planet. We're the global majority. 88% of people live in the global south. Much larger than the US, Europe, Australia, and the OECD combined. So China will take that bargain. Just triggering the process of that bargain, we don't actually have to finish it, will immediately give us the second bargaining chip we need to force the transfer of technology, to force new kinds of partnership with the OECD countries on our terms, not on colonial, abusive, extractive terms. So we can go to OECD countries and say, look, we give you the same bargain we just gave to China. If you transfer technology to manufacture and deploy wind turbine technology in the global south on our terms, high-speed rail technology on our terms, medical technology, on our, whatever the priority is for us, the building blocks of development and prosperity, they have no choice but to engage on different terms. Otherwise, they'll be left behind, lose access to the largest market, and so on. And the idea here is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to position Africa and the rest of the global South at the center of a new international economic order, at the center of a new international geopolitical order where we are the global majority, the arbiters of peace and security and trade and investment rules, not the recipients of pain by design of these colonial and post-colonial rules. So that is not my invention, of course. This is something that many of us, we've met in Cuba a few months ago and talked about what is this new international economic order that we want to co-design as people of the global South. And a lot of this comes from this report, which many of you have probably not seen. It's called What Now? Another Development. Next year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the publication of this report, which has all the components of an alternative economic development, international economic order that we should all embrace. So the time to act is now. The polycrisis, the so-called polycrisis, is calling for urgent, bold, and radical action. Radical not in the political sense, although you can take it politically, in the literal sense of the term, meaning you go to the roots of the problem. Because if we don't go to the roots, we're operating at the surface level. And when you intervene at the surface level, we call that superficial intervention. And it does reproduce the status quo. And just to paraphrase the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in the context of the civil rights movement in the US, and we should learn from those statements, he said, I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions, dangerous distractions. This is what we're dealing with today. We're constantly being served false solution after false solution to distract us from the real radical decolonization transformation that all of us are talking about. And that's how you build economic and monetary sovereignty. Without that, you're stuck at the bottom of the hierarchy. And that means refocusing the climate finance debate towards a just and equitable transition. Climate reparations cannot be done without a geopolitical leverage. You can beg for climate finance. You can ask for transfer of technology. It's not going to happen unless we create a geopolitical leverage. And finally, when I use the terms Pan-Africanism, Global South Unity, Global North Solidarity, these are the economic and geopolitical prerequisites for climate reparations, for just and equitable transition, for this new multipolar world. When we say Pan-Africanism, it's not just a nice fluffy word we say to each other in these meetings. It's a geopolitical prerequisite that we need to recreate in our system today. And this better system, I believe, is within reach. It's like a real Wakanda is right there, available to us if you watch those movies. And it's possible, desirable, and MMT shows us that it's actually affordable. I'm a
Wow, wow. Thank you very much, Professor Kaboub. A lot of things for us to reflect on, to chew on. I think that I was running through my mind just to see whether it was possible to summarize in any meaningful way what Prof just said, and it does seem to me that a couple of lines come to mind. No democratization without decolonization, no de-dollarization without decolonization, and indeed no decarbonization without decolonization. And he breaks it down in terms of the structural problems and the structural solutions. And I picked up that in his argument, that is where the whole question of just and equitable transition lies, the new international economic order, and indeed what he calls the new multipolarity also lies in there. And his three words again to end this is urgent, bold, and radical action. I think that is, according to me, at least a fair attempt at summarizing what he said. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the intervention. So I just have a very quick question to Fadhel, which is about the spectrum of sovereignty that you're talking about. Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, the way that it's conceptualized in MMT, the spectrum is like a hierarchy, right? No. Okay. So
not the same terminology, not the same.
Okay.
MMTers don't say hierarchy.
Okay. So I think it would be good if you could elaborate on how Africa as a continent moving up the spectrum, how that relates to third world solidarity, right? Like, is it possible for for everyone in the world to be equally on the spectrum? Or are you saying something about the African continent pushing out, what's the possibility of a polarizing problem there? Yeah.
Very good question. Should we take the next one?
Yeah, let's take that very quickly.
I'm trying to see whether this is working. Yes, it is working. Yeah, so my question is, you used two terms, sovereignty and security, and you said they're two different things. But that's not really the issue for me. My question is, when we look at the problem in Africa, the first thing that crosses one's mind is the choice of leadership rather than colonialism, is the choices of those in that position of leadership rather than whatever America or Europe does. And as a child, my mother taught me that the things I can handle myself should be my priority. The things that I need others to help me do. So, sorry, let me just get to the question quickly. So the question will then be, the failures of the leaders on the continent of Africa, shouldn't we address that first before we begin to talk about whatever is happening outside of our control?
Thank you. I think both questions are directed at you.
Very, very quickly, because now I'm the one between you and and lunch. To answer the first question, it's not a hierarchy. It's not a zero-sum game that, countries acquiring higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty don't push other countries at the bottom, right? All countries can have higher degrees of autonomy. In other words, it's not something that creates countries at the bottom, and I'm happy to elaborate later. The question about our political leaders, and I said it in the presentation, we cannot democratize a system that hasn't been structurally decolonized. In other words, we can have the most, honest leaders, and we did in my own country, in Tunisia. After the revolution, we had a fantastic, political system. We had honest people in office year after year after year. We voted them in and out because they sit in office and they realize that their economy is steered from abroad. They're actually not in charge. They have no fiscal capacity. They have to choose between investing in health and education, the democratic mandate that their people gave them, or service the debt. A lot of it is with the colonial entrapment. And if they choose to not service the debt and listen to their people, they get isolated and punished and called, corrupt, I don't want to use other terminology, but we did have leaders in the early days of independence who knew exactly what to do and spoke eloquently about decolonizing economic structures. What have we done to them? They were assassinated or sent into exile, right? Or the history reports this. So we're not saying that corruption is not important, leadership is not important. Absolutely, it's important, but we cannot blame everything on the political system and choice of leadership and neglect and ignore colonial structures that persist. These things didn't finish, didn't end. Especially when we hear off-the-record conversations with leaders from the global north, senior officials, who basically say that colonial hierarchy needs to continue, that you are not allowed to develop or industrialize because that's a threat to us.
Okay.
That is a reality. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. A big round of applause to my panel speakers here.